Welcome everyone to another great edition of CPAC Live. Today we're at a very special place once again where we were very recently with the President's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, and today we're joined by his National Security Advisor, Ambassador Robert O'Brien.
Great to be with you, Matt.
Great to be with you, Ambassador. This is an amazing place to be. So much history created in what I call the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, because I am a proud Kansan. The first question has to be, did you ever think you would be in this role, this important role that you're in, advising the President?
You know, you never think that's going to happen.
Right.
But I do recall, I was very lucky. My dad was a big Reagan supporter, and I remember watching that my first convention was '76 in Kansas and Kansas City. And
were you actually there?
I wasn't there. I watched it on TV, and unfortunately, we were a big Reagan household. Although we supported President Ford, of course.
Eventually.
And then back in 1984, I was able to come and intern at the RNC during the President Reagan's re-elect. So we spent a lot of time over here at the White House, and so it's a special place to be. And every morning, we think about the fact that it's a privilege and honor to walk through the gates and come work at the people's home and serve the country and serve the President.
And the hardest thing is you can't predict what's going to happen in a 24-hour period. You couldn't have predicted what we've dealt with this virus that was unleashed by China. You couldn't have predicted, the economic shutdown and all the consequences globally. I mean, you never know what's coming in this job.
No, look, the President's on call 24/7, and that means the senior staff that support him is on call 24/7. So it's a dangerous world out there. What makes my job satisfying is in the morning when the President calls, usually pretty early in the morning. He's an early riser. Is to be able to tell them, hey, the world's safe again today for the United States, Mr. President. But we have a lot of challenges out there, and it takes a lot of effort to keep it safe for the United States.
You brought up Ronald Reagan. Reagan famously had hobbies, and Reagan was at an advanced age, and they would often send him out to go ride his horse, and they'd get him out of the complex so that everyone, because when the President leaves the complex, everyone can take a breath. Do you wish Donald Trump had more hobbies? Because he seems to hit it like all day long.
Yeah, he works hard.
He works hard.
I've never seen anyone work as hard as he does. I remember one day that he called me. It was probably 6 in the morning at home, and he said, "Hey, are you here? Are you in Washington?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he goes, "What's going on?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to get a briefing here very soon, sir, and I'll call you back." But as of midnight last night, we're in good shape. We spent the whole day. We had a lot of meetings that day. We had head of state calls. And he ended up going to a rally that night, and I accompanied him as the National Security Advisor because we always, not for political purposes, but we always have a representative from the National Security Council.
Because you never know what's going to happen.
Correct, traveling with the President. So either myself or my deputy or chief of staff or one of our senior staffers is always with the President at all times when he's traveling. I happened to have the duty that day. And I think he got done with that rally about 11:30, 11:45, came down off the stage and said, "All right, how are we doing, Robert?" I was ready to fall asleep, and the President was full of energy and vigor at midnight. So he'd worked a long day that day, and you wouldn't have noticed it at all.
Everyone leaves an imprint. Obviously, every president has a legacy, and every administration tries to bring some innovation. And one of the things that this president has done, and you all have done, is had a new and fresh approach to space. Tell our CPAC community why that's important, including for national security reasons.
Look, the future for national security and for commercial security is going to be in cyber, and it's going to be in space. And we're pioneering people. We conquered the continent. We've got American businesses spread out all over the world. The next frontier is space, and unfortunately, it languished over the past 8 years prior to President Trump coming into office. But he had a vision for space. We want to get back to the moon. It's the ultimate high ground from a military standpoint. We don't want to militarize space, but unfortunately some of our adversaries are. We want to get back to the moon. We want to get to Mars. We want to look for commercial opportunities. But everything that we do going forward, whether it's 5G or quantum or AI and that sort of thing, is going to depend on satellites. It's going to depend on where we are on the different orbits around the Earth. But there's also going to be just tremendous opportunities as we explore beyond the Earth, beyond the moon, out into the solar system and beyond, and the President has that vision. He's put a lot of effort into it. But I'll tell you what else is exciting about space. It's the American private sector. I mean, what makes this country great isn't the fact that we have government programs doing things. We have a tremendously vibrant private sector when it comes to space. And what happened is the government drew back under the Obama-Biden years from space exploration. You had Blue Origin, you had Elon Musk and SpaceX, you've had Sierra Nevada, just a number, and then ULA and the traditional defense contractors. There was really an explosion of interest in the private sector in space. We've tried to foster that and at the same time rebuild NASA and make sure there's a real public-private partnership with our entrepreneurs and NASA to make sure that America maintains its leadership role in space. It's really been exciting. By the way, the Vice President's done a great job running the space effort for the President.
Yeah, great. And I think the American people feel like it makes sense.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about these technological questions like 5G. Do you feel like the administration has been able to break through some of these, there's always differences of opinion in an administration as you're trying to do something as important as, really compete with the globe to make sure that we have the best technology for our economy?
Well, when you look at what's happened with 5G, China was on the verge of taking over 5G, the entire world. And if they took over 5G, they would have access to all information that traveled, the Internet of Things, everybody's cell phone, everybody's social media, everybody's medical records, everybody's financial records. Communist China, the Communist Party of China, would have access to the entire panoply of data. I mean, there was a time when that would have swamped a country. You couldn't have done anything with it, but with artificial intelligence,
That's right.
Quantum computing, countries can take all that data, they can mine it, and become a real information superpower. Had China controlled the world 5G market, China would have controlled the world. This administration pushed back for the very first time. And now we have our allies, our close friends are opting for trusted providers on 5G. Huawei is receding in many places, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the United Kingdom, the United States, our allies in Eastern Europe, India. And so we want our allies to have trusted providers. We're not out pushing U.S. companies, but although there's some exciting developments in the U.S., on the 5G front and leapfrogging the Huawei technology. So we've got a great story to tell there. But we're also making sure that our partners and allies out there have trusted providers and are not in the hip pocket, at least technologically speaking, of the Chinese Communist Party. And this administration pushed back. And by the way, it was the president himself making calls to heads of state, urging them not to go the Huawei route, not to go the Communist Party of China route on 5G. He really deserves a tremendous amount of credit for.
And the
for
UK seemed to, make a better decision from at least our perspective.
Yeah, we were very pleased to see that. They're a critical Five Eyes partner. I'd mentioned at one time out in the sticks in front of one of the television shows that if the UK decided to go Huawei, we'd have to communicate with them with carrier pigeons and attachés with briefcases locked to their wrists. But fortunately, we're not going to have to go that route. The UK made the right decision, and we're grateful for that because they're a critical ally to the United States.
And when the ambassador says the sticks, he's not being disparaging for rural people like me. There's literally sticks outside here. He's actually disparaging the media because that's where they kind of assemble. And that's one of the interesting things about the White House is that here you are doing the most important of business, and the media's literally right out there. We have such a unique system.
Right outside my window.
Right outside your window. The other thing that's unique is when you talk about these technologies like 5G, in America, we really do it with the private sector. It's this private sector innovation that works with government. And when you have an administration that believes that the government should only do what it must and no more, that means the private sector's really got to innovate. It's up to individual Americans to take it and run with it.
Well, 100%. And the president wants to encourage the private sector. So one of the things we've done with 5G, which is going to help us internationally, but it also helps us here at home, the president has really pushed the Department of Defense and the other departments, Department of Commerce, to make 5G spectrum available to entrepreneurs so that we can exploit the bandwidth here in the U.S. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One, we want to have faster speeds for 5G, but we want 5G across the entire country. We don't want just 5G in the big cities or certain blocks of Manhattan or downtown Los Angeles or San Francisco. We want everyone to have access to 5G. And that means small towns in Ohio, that means farmers who can get fast data so that they can, with a GPS in their tractors and with programs in with their farming, that they've got the same high-speed internet necessary to produce food at an even greater rate than they have in the past. We want rural schools to have 5G so that kids that want to become programmers and coders and entrepreneurs and tech moguls someday themselves, if they're in Iowa or Pennsylvania out in the rural areas, they've got access to 5G. So it's important to get the spectrum freed up, and that's something that this president pushed on very hard. Mark Meadows, who you interviewed recently, took a key role in making sure that spectrum was available. It's going to be auctioned off very soon. That'll encourage then the tech companies to build the 5G handsets, the antennas, the radio relay stations, all the things that are necessary that go with that 5G ecosystem, because we've got a market for it here, they'll start building it and they'll be able to sell it overseas. So it really is a public-private partnership, and it's something the president has pushed very hard during his administration.
Ambassador O'Brien, Mark Meadows, Ajit Pai, I think good things can happen when you guys get together and create policy here. So you've brought up China, and I can't imagine anything that requires more diplomacy than this idea of, you had Secretary Mnuchin coming out the other day and reiterating that we're keeping to this trade agreement, which was historic and the president really drove to get accomplished. At the same time, our eyes are wide open to the threats of China. Have you found that, I know you're here working for the president, and it's the president's policy, but has your own approach over the last 25 years to China, has it changed as you can really see what they're up to?
So I was one of the early voices writing about China, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, about China's expansion into the South China Sea, China's bullying of Taiwan, the concern that the Japanese had about the East China Sea and the Senkaku Islands. I was worried about our Navy not investing enough in our naval forces so that we could continue to protect the Pacific. And it was great for me to come to work for the president because he has the same views on those issues. Look, what I've always said is we want a good relationship with China, but that means China has to stop stealing our IP.
That's right. Yeah.
China has to, recognize human rights. It was a shame what happened in Hong Kong, that a country that China had promised, or a territory that China had promised to leave alone for 50 years. Remember, one country, two systems. Well, Hong Kong is now one country, one system, and democracy is being extinguished before our eyes. It's something that our kids are going to be watching, and they're going to remember for many years, just like a lot of us, like democracy extinguished in other places around the world when the Soviets were so aggressive in the 70s and 80s. You see the continued human rights violations in Western China with the Uyghur population, with the Muslim minority, the way they're treated and put in re-education camps and that sort of thing. So we just saw recently the Chinese engaged in a very brutal border conflict with the Indians, where they ambushed Indian troops on the border and killed over 20 Indian troops in a horrific manner. So China is being very aggressive, very assertive. We'd like to have a great relationship with China, but we need them to stop being so aggressive and assertive. They can't have a big swath of the Pacific Ocean, which is called the South China Sea, which they've just claimed as if it was Lake Tahoe, next to Beijing or something. We can't have a situation where China continues to steal our intellectual property. Christopher Wray said in a speech recently that it's the greatest wealth transfer in human history, is the theft of U.S. intellectual property. It's stolen, it's taken to China, and then the products are built and shipped back here and undercut the original manufacturers that innovated and created and built these industries, and then they're put out of business. And the entire business, the entire industry goes to China. We can't continue to allow that to happen. So there are just a lot of things that China's going to have to do. The pandemic, China still has not come clean with us. On the pandemic, they didn't allow CDC doctors in. They didn't allow WHO doctors in early in the pandemic when it could have been stopped. They still haven't provided virus samples to us. This is the 5th pandemic that's come out of China in 20 years. We've had SARS and H1N1 and bird flu, and it's just one thing after another with these guys. And they need to start behaving, as a responsible country and as a country that we can partner with. But stealing our intellectual property, threatening our ships in the high sea, treating their neighbors poorly, these aren't engaging in unfair trade practices that led to a $500 billion a year trade deficit with China. Those are all things that have to stop. And this president is the first president in my lifetime. And Ronald Reagan's a hero of mine, but it was a different situation with China at the time. But President Trump is the first president of my lifetime that's actually stood up to the Chinese and said, stop. You can't continue to do this to the United States.
I think that some of these democracy advocates in Hong Kong, really students, young people, they invited us to come stand with them. And what I was taken with was the coverage in kind of the Western media that somehow the Trump administration wasn't a voice for democracy in Hong Kong and the agreement, right? The agreement, the promise made to Margaret Thatcher. But it was interesting because the kids on the streets, they obviously knew I was an American. I stood out, and they would come up to me and say, you go back and tell your president that he's the first American president that we feel has our backs. I don't think that story got told enough, that people who advocate for democracy around this country or want religious freedoms, they really see a strong advocate in Donald Trump and his administration.
Well, the president has sent out his top officials over the past year to speak out about China. Whether it's human rights violations or democracy or the way that they're treating our country with unfair trade practices and intellectual property theft, the unfair manner in which they access capital in the U.S.
Right.
Just across the board, some of the vice presidents spoke and had a major speech at the, I believe it was the Hudson Institute. My deputy, Matt Pottinger, gave a great speech in Mandarin, in fluent Mandarin, talking to the Chinese people directly. And they put their firewall up and tried to do everything they could to keep that speech in Mandarin out of China. I gave a speech about the Communist Chinese Party and their ideology, the fact that they've never disavowed Stalin, that they are really a Marxist-Leninist country. Yeah. Christopher Wray came out and gave a speech this summer as well, talking about the espionage. They're opening a new case on Chinese spies in the country every 6 or 7 hours. There are spies, Chinese spies everywhere in this country, engaged in economic espionage, but also in national security spying against us. Bill Barr gave a great talk on China and its influence in the United States and its the use of propaganda, and then Secretary Pompeo wound up with a great speech about what we're doing. And we've taken well over 100 actions against China to make our relationship with China more reciprocal, to make it more fair, and to protect the American people from really predatory practices across the whole spectrum of issues.
And continued arms sales into the region, I've been reading about. And Secretary Azar went to Taiwan, which was an important trip. So it just seems like, on the one hand, try to do everything to have a stable relationship. On the other hand, be a realist about what's happening.
Look, we have to be. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the trade deal that the president negotiated he did one with Japan, he did one with South Korea, he did one with Mexico, and Canada, but then he did this trade deal with China. And it was the first time we ever had a somewhat fair trade deal with China. Now, it was only phase one, so it only addressed half the problems, but it was a great phase one deal. The problem is, as soon as that deal was done, China unleashed the COVID virus, and instead of bringing our experts in, instead of working with our medical professionals and medical professionals around the world, China shut off travel within China, but folks from Wuhan and Hubei province continued to travel around the world and took the virus everywhere. And
shutting down that travel and shutting down our border, these were historic steps that were taken very early.
At great courage on the part of the president. So when he was first really warned about the crisis that we were facing at the time, I don't think that we'd had a death on January 28th. I don't think there'd been a death in America from the COVID or the China virus, as the president calls it. We told the president this is a serious national security threat. Within 2 days, on January 30th, he made the decision to ban travel from China. And that was a tough decision. The stock market was riding high. There were a lot of folks on the economic side of the ledger that said, you can't do that. You can't ban travel from China. It's going to hurt the economy. But the president put the American people first, which he always does, and which I've seen in every single decision he makes. He put the American people first there, took a tough decision. Now, what's happened is the Democrats have said, well, no, 40,000 people came in after that. They were American citizens. We weren't going to cut off American citizens' ability to their ability to return home.
They were also tested to see if they had the virus.
We quarantined them. Right. We screened them the best we could based on the medical information we had about the virus at the time. And so we did let Americans come home. But that decision to cut off travel from China, there's no doubt about it, saved thousands and perhaps scores of thousands or hundreds of thousands of American lives. He made a similar tough decision just a little over a month later with respect to Europe. And again, and the United Kingdom and Ireland, and that was a decision that many opposed because they said you can't cut off travel from Europe. Unfortunately, by the time we cut off travel from Europe, there had been so many travelers from China to Europe during that period of time that we'd cut off travel from China, but many European countries had not yet done so. The virus had spread rapidly to Europe and then got in through the east coast of the United States from people traveling from Europe, which was really a shame. But the president's action on both those fronts, there's no question about it, saved a lot of lives. And by the way, he wasn't just criticized. There were people that had concerns about it within the administration, but he was roundly criticized.
He was.
For being xenophobic, for
People tried to turn it into politics, and really all it was a decision to try to shield us from a virus we didn't know much about yet. We just didn't know how lethal it would be and everything else. And thank God the decisions were made. And I think those decisions politically could have gone a lot of different ways. But if your barometer is the health and welfare of the American people, you kind of let the chips fall where they may.
No, and look, that's what this president does.
Yeah.
And you see it happening even up and through. He's going to keep being president through the election, not for political reasons. He's going to keep just doing what's best for the American people every single day that he wakes up and comes into that Oval Office.
The other thing I think that the other imprint that kind of pops in my mind is his approach to the Middle East. He gave this amazing speech in Saudi Arabia, diplomatically pushing this idea of human freedom and religious freedom and tolerance and openness and economic opportunity and economic freedom, and it's really rippled through, I think, that part of the globe in a very special way to have an American president, the tip of the spear on the idea of these freedoms and human dignity. And now you've had this great agreement between the UAE and Israel. This is historic stuff.
No, it really is amazing. And isn't it funny, Matt? I mean, we talk about this as conservatives, and we've talked about it for years and years. Ronald Reagan talked about it. President Trump's talked about it. We stopped appeasing Iran.
Right.
We supported our ally Israel. The president did something that every presidential candidate I can remember for the last 30 or 40 years and said, I'm going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. The last time they would say that would be at their convention, the nominating convention. This president made that promise, and he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And folks said, oh, it'll be terrible. There'll be a cauldron in the Middle East. What happened?
Even some voices in Israel would say, you're going to unleash war if you do that.
Folks realized that the president meant what he said, that he supported his allies, and we did the same thing with the recognition of Golan. We took very strong action against ISIS. So instead of appeasing ISIS and having restrictive rules of engagement that didn't allow our troops to fight the terrorist, he put rules of engagement in that allowed him to mop up 100% of the caliphate, which was the size of Great Britain. We stopped the appeasement of Iran and got out of the terrible JCPOA, which was the worst diplomatic deal since,
I used to call it Iran gets a nuclear weapon deal. It was always poorly worded.
In 5 years, they get all the conventional weapons they want, and in 10 years, they get nuclear weapons. It was the worst deal in diplomatic history. You'd have to go back to 1938 with Chamberlain negotiating with the Germans in Munich, and it was shameful. And the president got out of that. And again, people said, oh, this is terrible. The maximum pressure campaign on Iran has worked. So taking out the caliphate, maximum pressure on Iran, supporting our ally Israel. And now what do you have? What are the fruits of that? The fruits are you have a booming Israel that's a great country, a model democracy in the Middle East. You have Israel making peace with the UAE, only the third time in 70 years since the independence of Israel that Israel's made peace with an Arab country. And so President Trump, his name is going to go down with Carter and Clinton and Begin and Rabin and Perez and Sadat and Hussein and now Mohammed bin Zayed of these peacemakers in the Middle East. And it's really a tremendous thing. And I think there's more to come. I mean, we're working very hard. I'm flying out to the region on Saturday with Jared and others on our team. We'll be going to Israel, UAE, and some other countries. And we think there's going to be an ability, I hope, to bring a few more countries into a normalized relationship with Israel and continue to build on this peace initiative that the president started with.
And it's one of these things where you've talked about Reagan, 1976, 1980. It's one of the areas where we really should be able to put politics aside. Yeah. Everybody should be excited about, we've used this term peace in the Middle East. It's like become a cliche because it's just lost its meaning, but this is really happening. It could revolutionize how we think about stability in that part of the globe.
Well, and Matt, it also allows us to bring our troops home.
Right.
We've spent a lot of time in the Middle East and in South Central Asia over the past 20 years, and we've spent a lot of blood and treasure there, and our heroic soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines have just done a great job protecting our country and protecting our interests in the region. But we have challenges in the Pacific, we have challenges in Europe, and folks want to come home.
That's right.
And if we can establish a number of these peace deals and normalizations and get the countries that are our allies and our friends in the region working together, that's going to lessen the burden on the United States, on our taxpayers, and on our men and women who fight and defend our country.
Let's go to another region of the globe. In our neighborhood, the Western Hemisphere, I have a great first ambassador to a free Cuba. I happen to be married to her, Mercedes. I think that you just got to put that in the back of your mind.
Mercedes would be fantastic.
We're going to get there one day. We're going to have a free Cuba, and I think
Ambassador Schlapp sounds.
I think it sounds good.
Fantastic.
It sounds good. I'll carry the bags.
There you go.
But the
you'll be the trailing spouse. That's
yeah,
what the State Department refers to.
Is that what they say?
The ambassador and the trailing spouse. You'd make a great trailing spouse.
I don't know. I lose my way too easily. But the what's going on in our own neighborhood? You know, we're talking a lot about socialism, communism, the effect on the human spirit, and this has been a real problem in this part of the world. Are we making progress?
Yeah, we're making a lot of progress. So the president outlined last week, 2 weeks ago, for the first time in 16 years, a strategic approach to the Western Hemisphere. And that approach focuses on democracy in the region. It focuses on the rule of law. It focuses on economic prosperity. It focuses on securing our homeland, and it focuses on working with like-minded countries. We're really going through a renaissance in the Western Hemisphere right now that a lot of people aren't focused on. With the exception of 3 countries, the Maduro regime in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Nicaragua is still under Ortega, you know, speaking of, you know,
a throwback.
To the 80s. With those 3 exceptions, we have democracy and the rule of law in this hemisphere. It's a tremendous accomplishment. There's really a renaissance going on in the hemisphere. There are problems, and some of them are tough. I mean, the narco trafficking and the human trafficking that's taking place, it's heartbreaking what's happening both to our country and for the people that are being trafficked. There are a lot of things that we need to overcome. We need to make sure that there are economic opportunities for people across the hemisphere so that they want to build their own beautiful countries up and not necessarily leave and become an immigrant to the United States or another place because they don't feel like they have hope where they were born. So we want to make sure that folks in the region have hope and have economic opportunities and can build these countries, and they're terrific countries. I just got back last week. I took the first post-COVID foreign policy trip as the National Security Advisor to Panama and Colombia, and met with President Cortizo and President Duque, and we had just tremendous meetings there. We were able to deliver ventilators in Panama to help them with the COVID virus and their response to it, and talk about some of the infrastructure and energy projects that we're working on in Panama, how we're going to help them with a number of the economic projects that they want to do. We spent some time in Colombia with President Duque and heard his plans to eradicate cocoa fields and look for substitute crops. We brought in Adam Boehler from the DFC, and we're working on how we can invest in Colombia and encourage people to spend their livelihood not in growing cocoa and being involved in the drug trade, but in legitimate businesses. So there's some very exciting things that were happening. It was a great trip, and I can tell you the United States is the leader of the Western Hemisphere, and President Trump is incredibly well respected and is looked up to by the other presidents in the region. It's a great time.
Even with presidents he doesn't necessarily have a political agreement with, like right. A new president of Mexico. He seems to be able to get along with these folks to the country's benefit.
He's got a supermanner with foreign leaders,
yeah.
And they recognize that he puts a huge priority in the Western Hemisphere, and that's something that we haven't had for many years.
But I have a feeling in a second Trump term that he's so active and he wants to push so hard that I think it could break the historical mold on a Republican second term.
I think that's a great insight. And look, you know, President Reagan had a tough second term.
And they can't they can't throw anything else at Donald Trump. I mean, they have kind of tried everything. So
although President Reagan did come back at the end of the second term and finished up strong.
He did.
Certainly, President Bush had a tough second term, but the surge worked, but the media is so against you, and the town is so against you if you're a conservative. And you know this. You've lived here. You've watched it over many administrations. But Donald Trump is so unorthodox and is willing to stand up to the establishment in a way that no one has. Again, in my lifetime, I think. In some ways, I think if he's reelected, the American people are going to give him the first term that he was denied when he was elected in 2016 with all the investigations and phony scandals and that sort of thing. I think if he's reelected, I think he's going to be able to put his own people into government. He understands the government.
He's figured that out a little bit too, which is these appointments are dramatically important because the president can't possibly watch everything that's going on.
No, and he's got a
It's too
great
big.
team. He's got a great team now, and with the chief of staff and the White House counsel, and just within the White House with Jared and his team. And there's a fantastic group of folks here working at the White House, and we've got a great Larry Kudlow over on the National Economic Council. We really have a tremendous White House staff, and I think we've got some great cabinet secretaries out there as well. And so I think this if the president's reelected, it's going to be more like come 2021, January 2021. It's going to be more like a first term for a president than we've ever seen in a second term. Unique insight from you.
Are you getting tired?
You know, it's a.
You have a tough job.
It's been almost 3 years. You know, I started
Yeah.
out for about 1.5 years as the president's hostage envoy.
Right, and you did a great job.
Thank you. It was an honor to work with those families and help bring some folks home. We still have a lot of people that are being held hostage or that are wrongfully detained overseas. And so I always hate hearing. Thank you for saying that, but I hate hearing a great job because a great job would be getting everybody home. And,
That's right.
And
Yeah.
we're still working on it. So it's a work in progress. But there was a lot of travel in that job, and the president keeps me pretty busy here. But you know, the president's got so much energy; it gives us energy to keep going with him.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we appreciate you so much coming to CPAC, giving a very important speech about what's going on around the globe.
It seemed like a long time ago, pre-COVID. We had all kinds of people socializing
We
and
shook hands.
having dinner together. People
Yeah.
were shaking hands. I mean,
And
I hope it gets back to those days soon. Those were the good old days.
They were the good old days. And I'll tell you one thing, we're having CPAC in person, even if it's in my backyard, but it's going to happen. But I'm confident we'll have a big, vibrant CPAC. But I told you at the time that we had been to 5 countries doing CPACs in Asia, South America. We talked about Hong Kong. But I don't want you to worry. We're not globalists. We're internationalists. We're banding together with other conservatives across the world. And I think the soft diplomacy, the non-governmental diplomacy that goes on in the private sector, America leads on that commercially and just with these fraternal relationships that are being built.
Look, it's another great insight, and it's something when folks say that the president doesn't have allies or we want to restore our alliances, I don't even know what they're talking about. I mean, take a look at NATO. Tough diplomacy, tough, frank, candid conversations. But as a result of that, the president encouraged our NATO allies to spend $400 billion in additional defense spending over 10 years than they were planning to otherwise. That makes them safer. It makes us safer. That's a total commitment to the alliance. When you look at what the president's doing in the Middle East with our friends, when you look at what he's doing in the Western Hemisphere, the president is building alliances. I mean, I fear what will happen. All of the countries that are looking at making peace with Israel felt that they'd been shunted aside by the last administration that was spending its time appeasing Iran. We're for standing with our friends, not appeasing Iran. We did nothing over 8 years to stop the rise of China, and our allies were demoralized in the Pacific, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. We did not have great relations with those countries when we came into office, but because the president has rebuilt the military, has stood strong shoulder to shoulder with our allies, we're deterring the folks that would have us change our way of life or have our allies change their way of life. You look at what's happened in Eastern Europe. It's the president that sent defensive weapons to Ukraine to stand up against Soviet tanks, rolling through eastern Ukraine. It wasn't the last administration. So we're standing by our allies. We're taking the tough decisions to keep them safe and to keep us safe. And look, it's one of the great advantages that the United States of America has, is we have great friends and allies that aren't just bought and paid for or rented allies. These are countries like Japan, like the United Kingdom, like France, like Brazil, and I could go through and list 80 of them that share our values, that share our way of life. And when America leads, they're there to stand up with us and stand beside us. And the 5G that we talked about earlier is an example of that. Once they saw the U.S. was going to stand up and stand against Huawei and stand against the Chinese Communist Party, getting everyone's data, our allies started following our lead. And that's a great blessing that we have as the United States, is we do have that leadership role in the free world.
It's the connection between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, this idea of peace through strength. funding the military like you guys have done to the appropriate and historic levels, and making the American people understand that we don't really want to go overseas and start wars and get involved and put our young men and women in harm's way. We actually take the steps to make it very clear what we won't accept. Maybe we'll have more peace.
Strength works.
It works.
Peace through strength works. It always has.
It always has. Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Brien, for being with us, and thanks for your great service to the country.
Great to be with you, Matt. Thank you, my friend.
And we'll be right back to CPAC Live after this short video.
I think we're going to get a lot of votes. We did last time. People were surprised, primarily because of trade, because I know how other countries take advantage of us, and I understand that. And that's something that Bernie Sanders people really feel, because I understand trade. I've done USMCA now. I got rid of NAFTA, the world's worst trade deal. China tariffs. China had the worst year they've had in 67 years prior to the plague. The worst year they've had in decades and decades. And we had the best year we've ever had. But we took in billions from China. We never took in 10 cents from China. Never took in 10 cents. They took China for 25 years, and not only Obama, for 25 years, China was taking in anywhere between 200 billion with a B and $550 billion from the United States. I give them all the credit, number one, for being smart and outfoxing all of the people that stood here and their representatives. But China, we built China. We helped build. We gave them $300, $400, $500 billion a year. Because before that, and before the World Trade Organization and they getting into it, China was flatlined. It was after that happened. And then they took advantage of us because we didn't have people that were smart enough to see. And by the way, Biden would be the worst of all of them, because his son took out $1.5 billion and he gets fees on $1.5 billion, which is millions of dollars a year. Give me a break. China will own our country if this guy gets elected. We can't let it happen. We can't let it happen.
Matt Schlapp, that was fascinating to hear you and National Security Advisor O'Brien going back and forth on all of those topics. I could listen to another half hour of that.
You know, what I'm struck with, and I've talked to a lot of Reagan alumni, I'm struck with how many strong conservatives the president has in these key roles. You know, I didn't really know much about Ambassador O'Brien before he took the job. I had heard, nice things, good things, that he was competent, but what you really got in that interview is his strong philosophy on human rights, religious freedoms, American power, appropriately projected. I don't know, when I talk to those people in these jobs, I just feel like, we just had Ambassador Lighthizer on the show, we had Mike Pompeo on the show, we had Mark Meadows on the show, with a lot of others, and these people are doing a great job.
And it's clear there's a real list of accomplishments that have happened over the past 4 years that I feel like is not always talked about.
I forget
television.
them. I forget them. They have done so much.
It's a lot of stuff.
I thought President Bush was active when I worked in this very building for President Bush, and I used to keep a little list of accomplishments. But it was a different age. This is an age where an active president has to get stuff accomplished because Congress doesn't do anything. And I literally, when I look at the Trump list, it's page after page after page of accomplishments. I think it's a reflection of just kind of who he is, which Ambassador O'Brien brought out. This guy's, I call him a lion, or you call him a tiger. Like, he just is relentless.
These guys work their tails off. I mean, and it's a very high energy.
No, the staff gets tired. You can tell. He's running them ragged. And I don't think they're upset about it, because it's not like he's doing anything other but like pushing them to get more done.
Let me toss one thing at you before we go and we get into the evening convention events. One of my first memories growing up watching television was when they broke into regularly scheduled programming for Tiananmen Square.
Yeah.
And it was right around the same time the Berlin Wall fell down. I grew up loving...
When breaking news was really breaking news.
Right. It was serious stuff. It wasn't just at the top of the hour like CNN. When, growing up, I was a strong Reagan supporter. He was, the ultimate president. And it meant that I grew up an anti-communist with strong patriotic tendencies and knew that the Soviet Union and China was bad. And the ambassador he made this fascinating thing between Russia and China, talking about how China's the natural extension of what we were fighting against in the 1980s in the Cold War, which we'll have to do a whole nother show on. But how did we get to this point where Trump's position on China, which seems like such a logical thing coming out of the 1980s, coming out of the 1990s, what happened in those early 2000 years where we decided that we were going to ship jobs to China, that we were going to give them most favored nation trading status, that we were going to let them in the WTO because, blue jeans and McDonald's was going to bring Jeffersonian democracy to this communist regime? What the hell were we thinking, man?
No, it's a really good point. I think that to step away from the specifics on the microeconomics, you have this question of, does economic freedom result in a more enlightened democratic government? And I think a lot of people were betting on this idea that if we had economic freedom, and there's probably some people that are libertarians who thought, if we have economic freedom, the other freedoms, religious freedom, human rights, it'll naturally kind of dovetail into it.
It worked in the Soviet Union.
And I think it worked in the Soviet Union in the sense, but they had a coup, right? And you have Boris Yeltsin bringing in freedoms. You had the crumbling of the old communist regime. You had the crumbling of their, the kind of whole, their client states around the world, including in Eastern Europe. So, but I think the China example was they took all the economic benefit and used it to make the communist government
even stronger.
So kind of the opposite happened. So I think a lot of people, I think in fairness, people who bet on the idea, let's start with economic freedom, we'll get other freedoms, I don't really judge them too harshly, because I actually think a lot of people thought, well, this could happen. They just bet wrong. They were incorrect. And the president has a different approach. And what I like about what he's doing is we're not tariff people. We don't love tariffs. But we hate the idea of stealing intellectual property.
Yeah.
You're not going to get the intellectual property and these national security questions into a better place unless you use the tools that you have. Now, I'd like those tools to be temporary. And I think the president would like them to be temporary. He'd like to have many more phases of this trade agreement with China. But there are these big questions, 5G, AI. Does China have a sphere in the South China Sea or in Asia? Can it pretty much do what it wants and we'll look the other way? I think the peace through strength reality that the president brings to this would say, that we're going to draw some lines. And unlike with President Obama, when we draw a line, we mean it. You step over it, there's a consequence. And I know when the president was elected, people said, he's crazy. He'll get us into wars. And what they didn't understand, and I've heard the president actually say this in informal settings, sometimes I want people to think I might be a little unstable or a little crazy because it's going to prevent them from doing something that could harm America. He knows when he's being aggressive on Twitter or being very strong with his language. He's doing it to effect.
A little bit of showbiz.
Yeah, it's a little bit of, hey, yeah, because he actually doesn't want to press that button. He wants to not press that button. Yeah. And if they know he's serious, he won't have to press that button, which is something Reagan taught us.
Yeah, I read this thing somewhere. I can't quite remember. It's thou shalt not steal. It's a thing.
It's a thing. Yeah, as old as the ages. Anyway, it's been a great honor to be back in a place where I met my wife. 2 floors down, room 180. I go to a meeting. She's in the comms department. I'm in the political department. We flirt with each other a little bit at a table. Literally, this could be the table, by the way. It was a table just like this. And it was Richard Nixon's old office, as would be everything associated with me. It probably wasn't the best room, but it's been a great life.
You made it work.
Yeah, she made it work.
Thanks for joining us on CPAC Live. We'll be back on Friday to go after see how the Republican National Convention went. I think you got David Drucker from the Washington Examiner who's going to join us.
Yeah.
And let's see how it goes this evening.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll talk to you soon.